Hi, welcome to the 3 Times podcast. Today my guest is a sociologist who spent many years studying popular music. Simon Frith is Emeritus Professor of Music at Edinburgh University, the culmination of an illustrious academic career, and he's written several books on popular music culture. He was the chair of the Mercury Prize for 14 years from its inception in 1992. I first came across Simon's work when he was a rock critic for the music papers and then the Sunday Times and Observer back in the 80s and 90s. When I discovered he lives in Tynedale, I couldn't wait to ask him onto the podcast to learn of his views on the state of current music. Our conversation covered the merits and otherwise of streaming, the ways we listen to music, the old days and new ways, and why these things are important. I'm not short of opinions myself, so it was refreshing to hear a sociological perspective that challenged my underlying assumptions. I hope there will be something that makes you think or presents a view that's not what you expect. You can find more about some of the topics we discussed by following the links in the show notes. Simon Frith, thank you for agreeing to talk to the 3 Times podcast.
That's fine.
You are a socio-musicologist.
I call myself sociologist of music rather than a musicologist.
Right. Okay, well, we'll come to that.
Because I know nothing about music at all.
Right, well, that's a shame. We'll come to that. You are currently, after a long and distinguished academic career, an Emeritus Professor of Music at Edinburgh University.
Yep.
In your former life, you've been a Professor of Music and a rock critic of some repute. That was how I first came across your name and your columns in the Sunday Times, I think, way back in the day. I'm not going to embarrass you with a long list of your achievements in life. I'm going to suggest that people Google that because it's all quite easy to find. But I would say that my favourite quote of all that there is online is that you were fired from the Scotsman newspaper in the 1990s for being too old.
Mm-hmm, that was true.
Which strikes me as being a bit premature, given the age range of people now listening to rock music.
Yes, I think it was. I mean, I don't think that would probably happen now if you look at the rock critics who've been writing for the British press forever.
That's right.
I think in the 90s it was still kind of assumed that the popular music column was designed to draw young people to the paper, which was doomed in every respect. So that was a particular policy there. And it was partly to do with office politics and who was my editor and that sort of thing too. I mean, it is interesting. When I went to the Sunday Times and was appointed what was effectively their first ever rock critic, the reason for that was not so much to do with appealing to a youth market or a pop market. It was for advertisers. And at the time when the amount of money being spent on advertising in the mainstream press by record labels on rock records was clearly growing, the Sunday Times felt it should be getting some of that market. And they could only attract that advertising for say, tours or whatever, if they could show that they were having proper coverage of rock music. And they already had a popular music critic called Derek Jewell, who was a little put out when they decided to have a rock critic as well. But I mean, it was a commercial decision in a sense, and then they had to find the right sort of person for their sort of readership.
And specifically rock, they must have recognised that the demographic that was listening to rock music was ageing.
I don't think at the time, I can't remember when I started writing for them, I guess in the 70s. I guess they were aging in one sense, they weren't teenagers, and they certainly had money to spend. And they were certainly, I remember that I had total free hand to write about what I wanted to, and the only time I ever had an instruction from on high was because Andrew Neil, who was then the editor of the Sunday Times, passed down to the arts editor that he would expect a review of Rod Stewart. Because he was a fan. He was Scottish, and anyway, so I had to go. I mean, I probably would have reviewed it anyway, but it was the only time I was sort of, and that had nothing to do with the youth market. It had to do with the editor's taste.
And now have we not come full circle with his turn at Glastonbury?
Exactly.
And how old is he now? He must be
older than me. So he must be in his 80s, I would think.
80s, goodness me.
Yeah.
That tells us a story about music, doesn't it? Which I would like to come to later, specifically. So, going back to how you describe yourself as a sociologist who studies music?
I'm a sociologist of music.
Of music, right. Could you explain what you mean by that?
What I mean is that I was trained as a sociologist, which means I was trained to think about how society works, how individuals interact, where values come from, those sort of general questions. And I was also interested in how societies change. I was studying in Berkeley, which is another story, but my actual PhD thesis was on 19th century education and changes in working class education. But when I got my first job, which was at Warwick University, I got a job to teach sociology and history. But because of what was going on around me, I very quickly got more involved in the sociology of youth culture. And the sociology of, obviously, youth culture meant the sociology of music, the sociology of media, and what was called cultural sociology. Mm-hmm. So applying sociology to kind of cultural change. And because I was also simultaneously being a music writer, it made perfect sense to try and use what I knew from that as part of what I did academically. Yeah. But at no stage was I ever, I can't read music. I've never played an instrument. Mm-hmm. I've always loved music, but it's always been me listening to other people play music. Yeah. So when I became a professor of musicology at Edinburgh, it was kind of unexpected. They wanted somebody in the department, which is quite a traditional classical music department. They wanted a sociologist because of various interests that students were beginning to have. And so they appointed me, even though I wasn't any sort of classical music person. Mm-hmm. And I think I was called the Tovey Professor, and Donald Francis Tovey was a famous musicologist. And I think there was a certain degree of shock in the department when they realised they couldn't actually read music. And I have to say, students, I wouldn't be able to get into this department. I wouldn't have any of the qualifications you've got. Yeah. So that was kind of an interesting challenge. So I didn't exactly study musicology, but I did get more interested in how musicians talk. So I sort of shifted my interest from fans to musicians, in a sense. Yeah.
Do you buy into the common theory that the youth market was awakened in the 1950s with rock and roll and the post-war generation?
I think it slightly distorts things. Young people had always been significant for lots of reasons. But I think one of the particular problems in the way in which the 60s got written about was that the significance of dancing was kind of underestimated. Mm-hmm. But in a sense, the rise of rock was in some sense sort of, this is for people who sit and listen rather than people who dance to it. Which is kind of unusual if you think of where those bands came out of, mod culture and loving soul music and things. So dancing was always crucial. And if you want to start looking at the history of dance, and it's clear that young people were dancing very significantly in the 1930s, certainly back to the First World War and certainly into the 1890s. So there was a youth culture around, but it wasn't thought of in the same way. And I think the change that happened in the 50s was in a sense that there were two things. One is there was a new kind of commodification, which was records, which had to think about the market in a different way. Mm-hmm. And the other was, and this is a harder one to explain, but youth started being catered for as a separate market in a way they really hadn't been. If you look at the 30s, there were film fan magazines, which were very much the basis for what became rock fan magazines. Mm-hmm. The whole notion of stardom and fandom really came out of that film called commercial films. But that wasn't really, it was sometimes seen very much in clearer terms of female fans. And, the creation of stars that male stars of sort of heartthrob type people. Yeah. But I don't think it was ever very specifically young people. So I think there was the emergence in the 50s because of the way in which the welfare state kicked in and full employment. It meant young people had income to spend, not to their parents, for the first time ever, really. Yeah. And so I think the shift was there, and then the music industry responded to a market that they could address.
So how much do you think the music industry has driven the change in music? Not only consumption, but style as well.
I don't think the music industry, as if we use that blanket term, has ever driven anything in terms of style. Right. Its skill has been to exploit and develop something that somebody smartly thinks we can make money out of that. But I think if we think of the industry more broadly, and not in terms of major corporations, it seems to me that the ideal has always been to have a very creative musician, with somebody who deeply believes in their creativity and is prepared to help develop it and actually sacrifice quite a lot. I mean, we never read interviews with failed music managers. I mean, one of my favourite books when I was researching was the memoirs of David Bowie's first manager.
Oh, right.
A guy called Ken Pitt, who was obviously seedy and not somebody one would approve of in one sense. But on the other hand, I thought, it is interesting to see these people who spotted somebody, but then just on the cusp of getting them successful, somebody more successful manager, which he needed, comes in and takes over.
Yeah.
So I think, at the bottom end of, just as there are many musicians who'd like to be famous in art, at the bottom there are many people who try and manage a band and fail abysmally or have run out of money or whatever. So I think to regard all the business as a single block of successful capitalists, it's more that at the top there are people ready to mop up everything that's already been developed and exploit it more.
Right.
I mean, we've got a situation now where the music industry seems to be obsessed with buying up old musicians' rights and then making money out of selling them to soundtracks on films and which has been around a long time, but they've only now cottoned onto it in a sense, which is a perfectly good model until people no longer want to listen to Oasis tracks on every film they go to, or whatever it might be. So you still think, well, somehow somebody's got to look after new music.
Yeah. That is one of the things I wanted to raise with you, the way that hedge funds have bought up huge swathes of legacy music, essentially Bob Dylan, David Bowie, and of course the Beatles catalogue has been bought up and was owned by Michael Jackson, wasn't it?
For a while.
For a while. I guess it's gone back.
But I mean, even before that, the key thing was it was owned by Northern Songs.
That's right, yeah. So these people obviously believe that kind of music, not all music, but that kind of music is so embedded in our daily life that it can be exploited for years to come so they can recover their huge investment. I mean, we're talking $80 million or $180 million, that kind of figure, aren't we, for these things?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they're going to be right or not. I mean, the interesting thing is clearly, and we'll obviously come back to this, the digital revolution made selling records a much more problematic business. But it hadn't changed the notion of rights and song rights, which has also been a very profitable business. And I remember I was friendly with a guy who was then running BMG, and there's a thing called PPL, which is Public Performance Limited, and he said all the big companies were on the board of that, but most of the time he was head of BMG, it would be a junior minion who'd be sent to their meetings because it wasn't regarded as key to their business, which was selling records.
Yeah. And
then they suddenly realised that actually the income coming from that was becoming increasingly more significant than the income from record sales. So suddenly they changed their tune and he would have to go to the board meetings. Yeah. So I think there was a sort of shift where rights were seen, record companies suddenly saw, I mean, they'd always been in the rights business, but saw performing rights, I mean, well, not so much performing rights, but playing records rights rather than individual people buying records was becoming a very significant part of the business. Yeah. And so once that happened, then various other big companies thought we could do this a different way by buying up the rights. Yeah. It's partly old musicians because they've got more likely to have control of their rights, that they bought them back. Yeah. Because Bowie was very early on, and he did a very famous interview where he said something like he was like a water company, and people were always going to want this. So it's important that he had the rights to controlling the flow.
He was a very perceptive man, wasn't he?
Yeah.
David Bowie, yeah. But I think that the streaming platforms, and perhaps Spotify in particular, have reinforced that model. I mean, it seems to me from what I've read that Spotify in particular has a lot of arrangements with record companies that help them get their music on playlists, and that a lot of those playlists are all about perpetuating this legacy catalogue.
Yes and no. I mean, I think Spotify is a bit like Uber or Airbnb, an idea which is to do with people being able to freely share things. Somebody comes along and says we can make money out of that sharing. And so Spotify, before Spotify there was Napster and there were all these things which were seen as illegal, where people could put their track on a thing and somebody else could pick it up. And Spotify kind of sold itself originally, I remember when it came out, as, now anybody can put their record collection on, you'll be able to hear these obscure records. Yeah. But once it started realising you can make money out of this, record companies moved in, and I don't know what the exact is, but all the major record companies have a major share of Spotify nowadays. I'm sure Liz Pelly writes about that.
That's right, yeah.
And so obviously record companies have their own interests in this. And Spotify has been very good at thinking we are a bit like a radio station now. We can persuade people who are listening that if they like this, they would like that. Yeah. And so you can begin to curate what people are listening to, and record companies obviously help to influence that process. Yeah. So I mean, one of the reasons I've never listened to Spotify is because I've always loved radio, but for me, the great joy about radio was you didn't actually know what you were going to hear next.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas with Spotify, you feel you can't escape from somebody looking at your tastes and deciding that's what they are.
Yeah, and that brings me to another subject that I'd like to talk to you about, and which you've commented on in the past, which is the difference in the way that people listen to music and buy it compared with how they used to. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, I mean, I think in the past, and it's very hard to explain this to younger people, if you heard a track on the radio and you wanted to hear it again, the chances, particularly if it wasn't a popular track, you'd heard it on Family Favourites or something. I remember hearing the Platters when I was very young on Family Favourites and loving it. But you have no notion you'd ever hear that on the radio again. So you'd have to go and hunt for it in record shops again. But when I first started buying records, the key local outlets were places like Boots and
Woolworths was another one.
Yeah, absolutely, Woolworths, very important. And so the specialist record shop, if you weren't in London, was quite hard to find if you were living I was living in North Yorkshire, so it wasn't exactly a hotbed of big record shops. So you had to sort of hunt for things, and second-hand record shops later on, when I was a teenager, became absolutely crucial to this. But nowadays, if you hear something you like, you can instantly listen to it and see if there's anything else. And Spotify will say, if you like this, you can like that, and so on and so forth. And we noticed it very strongly with the Mercury Music Prize. When we started that, which was pre-digital days, CDs are only just coming in now. It's hard to believe that the original Mercury, quite a lot of the entries came in on cassette tapes, which were commercially very successful for a while. But if you had a short list and people wanted to hear what they sounded like, their only option was to go into a record shop. If they had the right sort of record shop, they could possibly persuade them to put them on. But otherwise, they had to buy the record to see what it was like. And so it was definitely the case that particularly for the more obscure people nominated, their sales would go up immediately. But once digital technology came in, people could instantly go onto Spotify, decide if they liked them or not, and that was it. They didn't necessarily buy the records. It had no effect on sales whatsoever. Yeah. Its major effect, kind of ironically, became on how much they could charge for live shows.
Which has proved astronomical in some cases.
Yes,
isn't it?
Absolutely.
Astronomical, and I'm sure it's put live music out of the reach of many people. I mean, the Glastonbury ticket now, 200 and something, is it?
Yeah, but it means I think it was particularly, for the Mercury effect, was particularly important for jazz and folk groups that had a very limited touring circuit, can now sort of be elevated into the club thinking, well, because they've been on Mercury, we're going to get a much bigger audience for them, so we'll pay them a higher fee.
Yeah, and of course COVID has had another impact on the fees.
Yes, of course,
the venues has changed. Well, I have to confess that when music streaming became legal, I thought it was a really good idea because I have a box upstairs full of CDs, which, as you say, I went to, because I liked one track, I had to buy the CD, and the rest of it did not appeal to me at all. Even artists who now I would look back on and think, well, I was definitely very cool to like that in my day, the likes of Lou Reed, or Iggy Pop, I'd hear one track, I think, oh, that's great. But obviously it was their most commercial and most appealing music to a young person, as I was at the time, rather than to a seasoned music veteran. But it was very expensive, and it certainly limited the amount of music that I could listen to. So it was quite restrictive, and for that reason, I was pleased when the streaming platforms came about. But like you, I didn't like having things suggested to me that might appeal. I like to find my own music because I grew up, as you did, finding my own music, and I like things that way. I don't want anybody saying to me, unless it's a friend who knows my values, who's saying to me, oh, well, you might like this and you might like that. It seems to lack the integrity that I expect of musical enjoyment.
I think it also lacks, if I could put it this way, the sociability.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with what you say. I'm a very spoilt person. I was a rock critic for about 25 or 30 years. And in that period, I never had to pay for a live gig. Oh. And I never had to buy a record.
The dream career.
I mean, it's certainly a bit, because I actually did pay for live gigs and buy records of the sort that weren't in the record company's mailing list. But, there was a period when I was living in Coventry where the postman would be delivering me 5 albums a day. I mean, it was astonishing, really, when you look back at it.
Yeah.
So the cost was never particularly a thing for me. But what I do remember is certain radio programs become deeply significant, like John Peel.
Yeah.
There's never really been a record program since that has that sort of influence on how people, what they listen to. And he was astonishing because his taste changed. Mm-hmm. So you never knew quite what you were going to hear. Yeah. And I always thought the John Peel program was astonishing compared with Spotify. You could guarantee if you listen to John Peel, there'd be at least 1 and probably 5 tracks you loathed.
Yes, that's true. There was some difficult stuff on there, wasn't there?
And one of my feelings is that we've got into a state where I think people feel they should never listen to something they don't like, and that's just silly.
It is. I can remember John Peel playing a lot of The Fall.
Yes,
and
exactly.
at the time, I thought that was dreadful, but now I really do quite like The Fall.
Yes, no, I did. I thought that as well until he played one track, which I thought was wonderful, and then I went to see them and I changed my mind.
Yes.
But I think you're saying about how you can't afford to buy records. For a while, there was a very significant, for people who were music fans, tape culture. Mm-hmm. I had quite a few friends who we would send tapes to each other. Sometimes it'd be like a game, and you'd say, tell me. We'd have to see if we could send people tapes, and they couldn't work out who it was. But other times you just heard tracks you'd never heard, but they picked up on holiday or somebody given them things. Yeah. And so that listening was kind of sociable. And of course, that was also part of DJ culture really in the 60s and 70s, very much that DJs would play things you'd never heard. They prided themselves on having obscure imports or developing a jazz dance type scene or whatever it was. Whereas I think Spotify, the other problem about Spotify is it individualizes things so much. Mm-hmm. So the relationship is between you and Spotify, and as you say, they're telling you what your taste is. You're not talking to a friend and they're saying, listen to this, I know you'll hate it, but it's worth hearing.
Yeah, but talking about cassette tapes, I think there's another angle to that. When my wife and I were courting, we used to do mixtapes for each other.
Absolutely.
I would never dream of doing a Spotify playlist to somebody and saying, listen to this. I mean, I have Spotify. When I was on Spotify, I had Spotify playlists. I would never suggest to anybody, look at my playlist. I think you'd like it. It's very meaningful to me. Yeah. Because it just doesn't feel that way.
No, although it's interesting that when, I agree with you about exchanging playlists. When my wife had her significant birthday and we had them with family, my oldest stepson, who had been a DJ, used Spotify to put together a playlist of tracks that we knew she liked, which she'd probably forgotten from their childhood. Yeah. And Spotify was very useful then because you could just access everything.
Yes. Yeah.
But yes, otherwise, so in the sense that was a Spotify list, but it was downloaded so it could be put on put on when everybody gathered.
Yeah.
So it is useful. I find of all these services, from a point of view of a kind of music academic or historian, by far the best service is YouTube.
Yes.
It's amazing what you can find on YouTube, especially historically.
Yes, that's true. And I think YouTube's actually the biggest provider of music online now.
Well, that doesn't surprise me.
And people underestimate it because they just think of YouTube as being videos.
Yes,
but actually YouTube music, plus all the music that's on YouTube, it's vast, isn't it?
Yeah, and if you're looking for an obscure track, you can go on YouTube. You probably won't get a video, but you can still hear the track.
Yeah.
And someone's put it on. And that's much more like the original model of Spotify, that somebody in Italy has put on an ancient, old Cliff Richard record that I'd never heard. It's very bizarre how it works.
Quite so. And now we've kind of gone full circle in music formats with the resurgence of the vinyl album, haven't we?
Yeah.
I fortunately just replaced my hi-fi, which I originally got in the 1970s. Last year I got a new one. And I thought, I'll be able to play a lot of my old vinyl. Consequently, I've had to replace some of it. Well, I will have to replace all of it if I want to play it because it's in a dreadful condition. But playing new albums, which I have bought, it is a whole different experience from the way I've grown to listen to not only CDs, which now sound terrible to me, but also to Spotify, which sounds terrible in a different way. CDs are far too bright and brittle.
I agree.
Spotify is a bit muffled. Apple Music is better because it's got lossless streaming, but it still sounds a bit crisp. But the warmth of vinyl is just a joy.
Yeah, the problem for me with that is, and this goes back to the fact that I got records for free for so long, contemporary vinyl is so incredibly expensive.
Well, 20, 30 pounds.
I very rarely buy it. I think to myself, do I really want to spend that much on a record?
Yeah.
Now, when I've got so many other records at home anyway.
Yes, that's difficult, isn't it? I only buy LPs now if it has a special purpose, like there's an artist called Martha Hill from Newcastle who crowdfunded her last album.
Right.
And as part of the crowdfunding, you could buy.
Yes, I've done that with people.
Album.
I mean, a lot of people, artists like that, often on those sort of sites, or like on Bandcamp, they're often
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, the key choice is between getting an album or having a digital download.
And mostly, I get the digital downloads, but sometimes it's nice to think, oh well, I've got something physical that I can exchange for that. So what I'd like to ask you as a sociologist is, why is it important that I feel this way about music and you feel this way about music and the way that it's provided to us?
I think music was part of our lives, not simply in terms of what we enjoyed listening to, but in terms of friendship, social activities, parties. You know, it was part of, that was kind of how we saw our place in the world. And I used to have a very nice, with music students at Edinburgh, we had an interesting discussion about the relationship between boys and girls' tastes and what happened when they started courting, and then particularly what happened if they moved in together.
All right.
And I always remember the boy saying, well, he said, my girlfriend's got a really weird attitude towards music. I mean, she really likes, I can't remember who it was, I don't know, let's say Iggy Pop. But she's only got 2 of his records. She really liked him. She'd go out and buy every single one.
Yeah.
And I thought, this tells you something about the difference between different ways of listening or thinking about how music works in your life.
Yeah.
And it was very fascinating. You know, just get them to talk publicly about that and start arguing with each other about was interesting, because I think music is important to people, or was important to people.
Yeah.
Partly because of the work that went into knowing about it or getting. I mean, obviously there were some people who had no interest in music at all. I've only ever met one person in my life who didn't like music. Some people, music is just part of their soundscape. But again, we tend to underestimate in this sort of conversation the importance of dance and dancing. And dancing's always been a key part of sporting and lots of other things, and music is a key to that. And what music, you know, dance music remains a very significant part of, you know, how our social lives work. So while we can talk about all the problems of Spotify and things, for me, in my later career, I became much more interested in live music and how that was changing and how that's still significant.
Yeah.
And I remember reading, when Arctic Monkeys started out, there was a lot of stuff in the press about how they depended on the new digital technology and everything. But in fact, when I talked to them and their manager, it was clear that actually the way they became big was very old-fashioned. Very deliberately, they played an incredible number of small gigs before they released their first record.
Yeah.
So an awful lot of people locally had heard them, thought they were wonderful, told their friends.
Yeah.
And were kind of queuing up when the record came out. It wasn't to do with digital selling. It was to do with a good old-fashioned seeing a band live and being knocked out by them, which, again, in the end of the day, was how Oasis started too.
So it seems to me that if we've become a bit detached from live music because of streaming, then one manifestation of that is that music has become part of the background for a lot of people. And I would like to introduce the question of functional music here, because I think that when I talk functional music, I think most people would recognise Muzak in, you know, elevator music as a form of functional music. It seems to me that a lot of what would otherwise be called popular music, rock, whatever, has now fallen into the category of functional music, that it has become background for a lot of people. It's become something to do your homework to, or something that you have on in the kitchen while you're doing something else, rather than sitting down and listening to it. Do you think that's an accurate representation?
I think that's an inaccurate observation.
You know, I'm pleased to hear somebody disagree with me.
You give a wonderful description of how music has always been used.
Oh, right.
And the people who sat down and listened to it were a weird subculture of people who lay on the floor with their headphones and started going to listen to Pink Floyd all the way without stopping, and no one could interrupt me.
This is because I'm a child of the 70s, is it?
Yeah, it's because you're obviously into progressive rock somewhere.
Not at all progressive, no, but I come from the 70s. Yeah.
Well, what I mean is, I find this is very fascinating, because I got interested in this when I had to think about classical music. There's a kind of ideology of what perfect listening is. And in classical music, you sit like that and you listen and you're totally silent.
Yeah.
And I remember reading a colleague wrote an interesting piece about Benjamin Britten's attitude towards television. Britten originally was very anti-television because he said if people are watching television, they can't possibly be listening with the right concentration. They'll get up to make a cup of tea and things.
Yeah.
And I started to think to myself, well, I wonder if in a concert people are really listening to that concentration. And when I thought about myself, I thought, when you're listening silently, it's very difficult to describe what you're doing, but your mind is wandering.
Yeah.
And the music is sort of guiding the wandering.
Yeah.
So hi-fi and all that stuff that developed in the 60s, you got the perfect listening experience and you're like being in a concert hall and you're sitting at home with your headphones on. But in fact, of course, concert halls are the unusual thing, and certainly in rock and jazz and everything else, you're not sitting like that and listening. There's all sorts of other noises going on which you're taking account of. And at home, I can't imagine that many people sit down and listen to a classical piece all the way through without occasionally getting up and letting the cat out or pouring some more hot water into the tea, or it's always been an accompaniment of other things. So I think we can sort of fantasize about this perfect listening and say, oh, I know people don't listen to music like that anymore. And my response is, but did they ever listen to music like that?
In my defence, I would say I'm not the only one who goes to a live gig and stands there and becomes so lost in the music that I'm not aware of my surroundings until there's some Burke behind me who starts talking to his mate.
I completely
agree. So even if I'm at a loud concert where I can barely hear myself cough, there'll be somebody here and I can hear their conversation perfectly well. All the chinking of the glasses from the bar.
No, I don't mind looking at glasses as well. The thing I hated about rock concerts when I was reviewing was someone would suddenly shout, rock and roll!
But it's not rock and roll.
But I agree with you about that. In my fantasy world, I'd only go to live gigs and I'd be the only person there.
But that's quite embarrassing, isn't it? I've been to a gig of that kind.
I also, one of the things I liked as critic was going by myself to everything. And going with other people was somewhat problematic.
Yeah.
Because you had to talk about the gig and I wanted to have it in my head to write about.
Yeah.
But I mean, I agree with you in one sense that a perfect gig, but again, it depends on the music, and this goes back to dance music. In dance music, you can completely lose yourself in the dance music, and you're only listening to the music, but you're moving around and bumping into people or dancing with somebody else, and that doesn't take away from it. So those gigs which started, in particular singer-songwriter ones, where everybody's totally silent. I remember going with a friend to see Leonard Cohen, and when he started one of his gloomy things, she burst out into hysterical laughter because she thought it was so ridiculous. And we were expelled from the concert.
Well, there's a badge of pride, isn't it?
Yeah. And so there's a sort of preciousness about that, listening in silence. But I think, when I was writing about the history of live music, as I've done, there are disturbing things. It's only when you look back. I mean, the spitting in punk is just astonishing. Any musician you ever interviewed with.
I don't know how they could have put up with that.
Yeah, and then also just the sheer amount of violence there was in live music for a period in the 60s and 70s. So it's not always been
that's true.
Not always been an ideal place. But on the other hand, it has a sort of excitement to it.
So, violence, fighting, and spitting in music. Why is it that those behaviours were manifest with those particular styles of music? Was it the music was an expression of some kind of, I don't know, unified way of thinking, or was it just a good excuse for a bit of a fight?
No, I think it was. I mean, there were other things happening in youth culture and in society that meant there was an undercurrent of violence around, and certainly racial violence and all sorts of other things. And gigs were a place where people could gather publicly, which there weren't that many opportunities other than football matches, which also had a lot of violence. Yeah. And the music didn't exactly distract from that because it was very intense, very exciting. Yeah. I mean, for me, in my history of going to gigs, the early days of punk were the most exciting live music I've ever seen in my life. I'm not sure I would think so any other time, but at the time I was probably in my 30s, so I was too old for it really, but in my early 30s. But I just thought those musicians have such determination, it's just astonishing.
And they didn't care about prowess or competence or polish.
No,
it was more of a passion.
It was more of a passion, but it was also, and that's why some of those musicians really could in ways that we didn't really follow at the time. It had the most amazing, intense energy, which is not easy to have in music. Yeah. So often it was the bass and drums, which were absolutely crucial to how they sounded.
Yes, happy days. But those days are not past. There are plenty of live bands around now who can still do that in in a small venue, or even a large venue, I imagine.
Yeah.
No idea of that. I would like to go back to functional music.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if music is listened to as a way of enabling you to do something else, whether it's to help you do the shopping without feeling that you're the only person in the supermarket, or that somebody's listening to your conversation, or if you're in a pub, for example, and the landlord feels the need to put some music on so that nobody can overhear what the person at the next table is talking about, or whether you want something just to distract your mind while you're doing the ironing, that the maximum enjoyment that you can have from that music is less than if you were paying full attention to it. Now that may or may not be, I know, I'll take what you said earlier on. But I think if you devote a lot of attention to the music, then the enjoyment that you will get from it, the music per se, will be greater.
I think greater is problematic. It'll be different.
Different, yes.
I mean, I think there are a lot of things to unpack there. The most significant use of functional music, one could say, is film music.
Yes.
Which has a function in the film. And obviously one of the significant things in selling certain sorts of music, particularly, there was a time in American films where they always had a song at the end, so people went out. It was usually Joe Cocker and Jennifer Warnes, or an officer and a gentleman, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And that song would then become a big hit. And I don't think it was because people were remembering the film, but I think the song was chosen because it reflected the emotion in the film, and that emotion was an emotion that people liked feeling, nothing to do with the film, but a feeling of whether it was nostalgia or falling in love, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So the functional emotion, its emotional function could work in other contexts. So it's kind of functional, but in a different setting. And I think still, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that's why people want to buy rights, because if they can get a song placed and that sort of soundtrack. I mean, the very earliest when I knew record company people, the rights where they were selling astonishing, they would have put out a small indie record in London, and then it would be bought by a Japanese television company as a theme music for a gardening programme, which bore no relationship to the original song.
Well, even now, if you can sing a song, then you stand to make big money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think one can say, why are you listening any different if you're ironing? You're concentrating on ironing, but the music can actually still be moving you in the same way as if you're listening to it without doing anything else. So I think it goes back to this notion of music is part of life. And there is some music you might want to be completely isolated by yourself. And all of us think, sometimes I just want to listen to this music and not be bothered.
Yeah.
But I mean, I find I can't really write with music on because it distracts me too much.
Yeah, me neither. That's the one I can write in a train station or an airport or a hotel, but not if there's music. Yeah,
and I always used to like writing in libraries. I like a little buzz of conversation, but nothing that distracts me.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I can do lots of other things to music on, and sometimes I'll stop doing what I'm supposed to be doing, listen to the music and play it again. And that's why radio was always so good, because you'd suddenly hear something, stop what you were doing to listen to it. So I think we can't. I mean, even I agree with you about functional music in public places, and there have been changes. I remember when I was living in Coventry, I would go to Sainsbury's on a Saturday afternoon, and they always broadcast Radio 1, and it would be John Peel. And you'd have the strange experience of pushing your shopping around where there were all people listening to Captain Beefheart.
That is weird, isn't it? I had some similar experience in Waitrose in Hexham, which is an upmarket supermarket with a more senior customer base. And I was wandering up the dairy aisle looking at the expensive little pots of pickles and things, and I suddenly realised I was listening to Iggy Pop. And I thought, poor Iggy Pop, he was the bête noir of the 1970s, wasn't he?
Yeah, but it's like Johnny Rotten selling butter or
yes, exactly so. Yeah,
but Waitrose doesn't have music anymore, or does it? Maybe I just don't notice it. I mean, I think a lot of supermarkets have stopped having that sort of music. Right. But I do notice it very much the place it's most noticeable is in restaurants rather than pubs are noisy anyway. Restaurants with bad acoustics, music is a real pain.
It is.
You can't hear anything.
It is, yeah.
But functional music always used to be thought of as music in lifts, but I think radio a lot of commercial radio stations, and the non-stop functional music is
I agree.
deeply irritating.
I agree. I live in a terrace of old houses, as you've seen, and there's always a house having some building work done to
and you hear
with the scaffolding. And the builders have their... it's not really a ghetto blast, because it's like a Tonka toy radio that they get from the builders merchants, and they've got heart radio blaring out.
Yes, exactly.
And you think, well, they're not actually listening to that, and then all of a sudden they'll start singing along with it for 10 or 20 seconds, and then they'll stop.
Yeah. Well, I can see about that if you're doing a tedious job, having music on.
Yeah.
It gives you a different sort of rhythm, in a sense.
Yeah. So I'm beginning to think that I'm being a bit harsh on functional music, but my case is this, that Spotify in particular seems to be encouraging what I think is a devaluing of music, because it makes it something that you just put on in the background.
I agree with you. It goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that Spotify doesn't want you to be upset or disturbed or suddenly thinking about anything. So the thing that's more worrying is not so much that it's functional music, but it seems to want to kind of, for you to create your own functional music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it says if you listen to this, you like this, which means you're going to be listening to the same sort of thing without ever changing. I mean, it's a bizarre way for a music industry to run, actually.
And it's people have said to me, if you don't listen to a streaming platform's suggestions, then you're not ever going to hear new music. But of course, you do hear different forms of the music that you're already listening to. You don't hear.
You don't hear anything that's new in a real novel sense.
Yeah,
I agree.
And one aspect of this that comes to my mind after reading this book that we referred to, Mood Machine by Liz Pelly, is that, and again, I'm coming down on Spotify here because I haven't read this about another streaming platform, although I imagine it happens. Spotify is actually commissioning organisations to create music for its streaming platform, which it then inserts into its playlists.
And assigns fictional authors.
And assigns fictional authors to it, because then it doesn't have to pay royalties.
Absolutely.
And pitiful as the royalties are from Spotify, there's still a significant amount of cost to it. So this seems to me to be a particularly creepy thing about the way that streaming platforms use music. What's your view on that?
No, I completely agree about that. It's not unexpected, because any company that's making money the way it makes money is going to think, what else could we make money out of?
Yeah.
So if we have the rights as well as everything else, then if we can employ people, because we're trying to find music music people like, it's easy enough to go to I mean, it's a bit like the use of library music.
Yeah.
Where people want music that sounds like a storm, and there's a store of like music that you can go and you can buy it. So Spotify's making its own version of having its music library that it makes itself. Yeah. I mean, it's more depressing to think that people then listen to it.
Do you think they notice?
No, because I don't think you're expected to notice anything on Spotify. It's to keep you listening without thinking, shit, I don't like that, and turning it off. They don't want that.
Yeah. And of course, the impact on musicians is quite significant, because not only are musicians now not recording music that can be heard on Spotify, but it's taking up the capacity of the streaming platform where new music ought to be introduced.
Yeah, I mean, I don't listen to Spotify, so I don't know if it's still. For a while, they had quite a clever guy who had been key to Napster. I don't know if she writes about him, who actually kind of produced a playlist of new music, and his skill was to kind of put together new music that fitted in with what else was going on.
Yeah.
But he was employed to be a way in which new music could be introduced, but I'm not sure if they even do that now.
I don't think they do. Reading what Liz Pelly says, it seems as though Spotify has moved on from that.
Yeah.
Because her case is that it's pursuing revenue at the expense of at the expense of art, essentially. Yeah. That brings me to the thorny issue of AI, because Spotify is reportedly deliberately using AI to create music, but it then inserts into playlists. So I was wondering what your view about AI is, given that we're constantly being told that it's going to revolutionise the way we live, and we are being given, well, essentially it's being forced on us through Google and Microsoft, and I don't know about Apple so much, but Google, for example, has placed AI in its search engine, and you can't get rid of it. So we have no choice about the role of AI in our lives. So what's your thinking about the way it might affect our music?
Well, I don't think AI is a deliberately misleading name for it. I mean, basically what they've got is huge data banks from which predictions can be made, which your AI facility means you can survey instantly vast amounts of previous music, and then produce something which follows that music. So, in a sense, AI is a perfect solution to Spotify's problem, because they can produce the whole of their playlist using AI, and it probably wouldn't sound much different from what it does already.
Yes.
So I think
does that matter?
it doesn't matter if you don't think Spotify is something you'd ever listen to. It does matter if that's what most people listen to all the time, because it means that its own model produces this way, as we just talked about, commissioning its own tracks, is a way of thinking we can get rid of musicians and produce this musical experience using AI, and I'm sure that will happen more and more. I mean, it would be interesting to see if film companies start doing that. Just get rid of film composers and just get people to get their AI to store the data of endless movie music and produce it. So I think in that sense, I mean, that AI is definitely going to affect things. I think we have to go back to the human element. A long time ago, I was invited as a researcher to a meeting of the top executives of Universal when Lucian Grange, who's now the overall boss, was boss in Britain. And he was talking about the early uses of digital technology, and he said two things that always struck me. He said that from a record company's point of view, an album is a terrible waste of money. We'd be much better off producing EPs regularly. And he said the problem is that musicians, and particularly their managers, think of an album as like the artwork. It's like saying to a novelist, we don't want novels anymore, we just want endless short stories. And you can't, and because artists have the power in one sense, you have to go along with that. But he said in the ideal world, what you would do is you'd have an EP coming out every 9 months or so, and you would film video, the making of that, and that would be available as well, so that people could engage with the artists in this what felt like a personal way through, going onto their Facebook or whatever. And you'd have this combination of music you could constantly buy with this personal touch and this relationship. And so I always thought that was interesting because it shows them how early days of how they were trying to think about this. But that human thing, I've always thought that was interesting. It still remains important. You know, if you see the biggest acts in recent times, somebody like Taylor Swift depends on having been able to engage an audience in a certain sort of way, a particular sort of identity. People feel they know her. And that becomes very important to her stardom. And all these new stars who I've never heard of, but, that our children or grandchildren know about, and I think never heard of her, and then it turns out she sold 20 million copies in the last year or whatever it might be. But then you realise that this has all been based on selling her and her music as a sort of joint thing. And that what she says and how she writes songs is significant. I mean, I know in Japan they've created completely artificial pop stars and they've been quite successful. But I don't think there's still something else, the sort of human element in it that is important.
As live music becomes, I was going to say more siloed. I'm not sure I mean that. It's my impression that the number of people who go to watch live music is getting smaller. Leave aside the major festivals.
Well, I think you can't leave aside the major festivals. But I think it's probably true that, I mean, we can come back to this. Local live music scenes can remain just as they always have been. And major festivals seem to have been able to survive the pandemic. I think and also very big arena concerts. But I think the sort of middle level concerts has declined. The bands that haven't actually become superstars but are on their way up. I haven't really investigated. It'd be interesting to see how Sam Fender's tours work, for example. When we know he can sell out Newcastle Football Ground, for 5 nights running. But where he's playing elsewhere in the country, to what sort of audience, I don't actually know. That would have been a thing I would have been. I was still active. I would be interested in.
Making that leap is now more difficult, isn't it? Given the dominance of legacy artists on streaming platforms and how difficult it is for newcomers to break through.
And if you look at the live ads in where they still exist, tours and things, the tours seem to be much more for one-off shows in big venues, and there's less a sense of, I don't know, Motorhead playing 47 gigs around the country.
It's very expensive. I have a coaster upstairs with a copy of a ticket of David Bowie's appearance in Newcastle City Hall in 1972. I saw him on that tour.
I saw him in Bradford Town Hall.
I saw him on that tour in 1972 in Bristol, and the seat cost a shilling or something like that. But I went online where you can find his tour list, and he played, I can't remember how many weeks it was, but every day for several weeks, sometimes twice a day on that tour. So that must have been 40 or 50 or 60 gigs. And there was a YouTube video posted recently by a blues guitarist called Chris Buck. Do you know Chris Buck?
I know the name, yeah.
He's worth checking out because he's a really, really good guitar player. For the purposes of the listenership, the cat is making another appearance in one of my episodes. Hello.
But not saying much.
Not saying, she normally does. She normally has something to say. In which he explains how much it costs to do a tour in this country. And I think they've got maybe 4 or 5 gigs. And 61,000 is what it would cost the band. And they will struggle to make that money back.
That's interesting.
So
what are they spending the money on?
It's accommodation, travel. I don't know whether they were sharing part of the costs of promotion, or whether they had to cover the ticket costs or whatever.
Yeah, they might have to guarantee cost sales and things.
So it was it was a big obstacle, and his band is called Cardinal Black. They play kind of easy access rock music that would appeal to a wide range of ages. So the audience is potentially large, and it's a struggle for them.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you read any band on their original tours, I mean, basically they didn't eat or slept in one room or things.
That's right, yeah.
I think it's. I think there are other things happening which are interesting, which is probably more your case than mine. That it is astonishing to me now what percentage of live music gigs on any night in Britain will be cover acts.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Which means that suggestion that there's an audience, and the audience isn't necessarily the original fans. So, I was reading, somebody wrote an interesting book on cover bands talking about how they interviewed people at a Smiths cover band concert, most of whom were in their teens and 20s.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we come to this because we'll never be able to see the Smiths. And we like their music, and this is the closest we'll get to the live experience. And I thought that was interesting.
I was at a gig at the Tannery a couple of weeks ago with a local band who are a really good band. The originals, I think, are really good.
Yeah.
They would play mostly covers, so, and I said to them, what's going on? Well, they said, you've got to play covers if you go to a pub. And they were playing The Cure, The Clash, and music from the oldest was obviously The Clash from the late 70s, 80s and 90s stuff, not Britpop, bit of Oasis. The people who were listening were 18, 19, 20. They weren't born when the stuff came out. Yeah. So they're not listening to the stuff, or they don't go out.
It's not nostalgic listening.
Well, it's hard, they don't go out to listen to the stuff that's their contemporaries make. They go out and listen to the old stuff.
I mean, you could say if you were a certain sort of rock critic, that's because the music was good then. There's
it's true.
I mean, The Cure was a great band, so why not listen to them?
It was, and I'm sorry I never saw The Cure.
I did. I fell asleep. And I wrote a review saying they were the best band to fall asleep to I'd ever seen. I got a lot of abusive mail.
I'm not partial to The Cure now. But I would like to go out and see a band that's making contemporary style of music rather than a band that's doing rock from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I wonder what that really means. I mean, if you went to see the Beatles when they started out, they were essentially playing covers.
They were.
Rock and roll and R&B.
Yeah.
And they did it very well. And then clearly when they signed to a record company, they were under pressure to write their own material because it made more money. And they were good at it, so that was great.
Yeah.
But if you read about the other bands, I mean, the Rolling Stones, they basically had to be told, you've got to write your own songs.
Shut in, by legend, shut into a room until they came out with a song.
Yeah, and you know, the Kinks were the same. So there was a moment when that notion, which was partly commercial but partly fed in sort of ideology of music becoming a kind of art form, is that you needed to listen to, you know, you go to a classical concert and you don't mind if people are playing Mozart, or so why wouldn't
That's
they
very true.
pop concert? Why wouldn't they play The Cure?
Very true. And in the war, my mum used to go to dances, and the bands would play Glenn Miller music.
Yes,
But Glenn Miller was, you never saw Glenn Miller because he was far too rare a commodity.
Yeah.
But it was the music that people went to listen to, not the band.
Yeah.
But that changed in the 60s, I think, didn't it? Do you think?
Well, it probably didn't change with bands.
No.
But it changed as the dancing culture changed. And then you could use record. I mean, you know, obviously, once records started getting used and you got discos, that was something different.
Yes.
But so I think I mean, it's interesting. Jazz. It's interesting to look at other cultural art forms there. I mean, jazz and folk have always had this balance of playing standards and playing new stuff.
Yeah.
And it becomes interesting that, you know, if you're a contemporary, people who are trying to make a living out of live jazz in Britain, they've now reached a stage where they might cover what would have once been regarded as avant-garde jazz in the 50s and 60s, like a John Coltrane number or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and then folk, similarly, you've got both playing tribute to the past, but then feeding in your own songs.
And reinterpreting it with you know, modern instrumentation.
That's right. So, I mean, that would be interesting if you did, somebody did a Cure revival, playing different instruments.
God, they do that, don't they? There are, for example, acoustic versions of there was it was a Fleetwood Mac tribute. I hesitate to call them tribute because they weren't playing it in the same instrumentation, but they were doing acoustic versions of Fleetwood Mac.
That's an interesting idea.
But Fleetwood Mac would lend itself very well to that.
Yes, absolutely, because that's, But I think, I mean, you know, I'm not really arguing anything other than thinking aloud. We certainly grew up, in my generation, switching to a notion that music had to be new. Mm-hmm. I mean, when the first live act I think I ever saw was probably Jerry Lee Lewis, and that didn't mean anything other than I loved his records, and it was a kind of style which was actually, by the time I saw him, well out of date. Yeah. Then there was a whole thing about music had to be, you're constantly having to produce new things, even though many of those new things were just variations. I read a book which hasn't come out yet, which is a fascinating study of all those records by big names in the 60s and 70s, singles that failed.
All right.
Which is interesting because it sounds a very peculiar book, but you know, it's interesting because we think that once somebody becomes a star and they'd had 3 hits, the next one would be bound to be some sort of hit, and it wasn't. Yeah. And you have to think about, you know, why not? And you realise how much bands repeat themselves because that's what they know people like. So, and that's how the people choose what to release. Yeah. And there comes a moment when people thought, I've heard that, I don't need another version of it. So newness has always been a slightly problematic area. It's good when it starts, and then, as you were saying earlier on, it becomes routine. Mm-hmm. When bands play something new. There are very few bands who you go and see and think, I'm going to this gig, but I have no idea what they're going to play. Yeah. Neil Young was one of the few people that was true of, and Lou Reed, funnily enough, also. You're never quite sure what sort of gig you get. But mostly people go to concerts to hear what they already know. Yeah. And I remember going to see a Boy George thing, and they didn't play their big hit. All right. And you could feel the disappointment in the crowd, and of course they came out to do it for the encore. Yes. And it made me realise that people are there to hear things that they know already. Yeah. I've read in my extensive online research about your writings that, and correct me if I'm wrong, you believe that the first 1 or 2 albums of the band produce are by and large their best. Yeah, I mean it's not quite like other art forms. Mm-hmm. I mean it can be for some, but because of the way it works commercially, your first album is likely to be the thing that you've been working on, you've developed, you're experimenting, you're trying to find your own sound. Yeah. You've got noises in your head you can't quite make. And if it's interesting enough, it'll be successful. And you then have more money and more time. And probably the second, third, if you're a good band, it'll be even better because you can do things you couldn't do before. But then you hit the notion that it's become a routine, there are people expecting you to do things for money, you're going on tour and playing the album. I mean, I always used to think there's been a recent habit of musicians from the past going out and playing their famous album from beginning to end. Yes. And I think that's interesting. I have never been to one of those gigs because I don't really like going to revival-type bands. But I always used to think it was interesting that a band makes an album and it becomes successful, and they go on tour. And the tour is usually planned around the release of a new album. But they've got a dilemma then, because the people coming to it want to hear the previous album.
Yeah.
And the new album, they don't know it, so they may not be so interested. So there's very few bands that will go out and each tour will be completely different.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I think Led Zeppelin were interesting. I don't know if you saw that film about them.
I did.
I thought it was very good.
Yeah.
In showing you how musicians like that worked.
Yeah.
And they had a real sense that they were able to develop what they wanted to do. Even if the crowds, audiences didn't like it, that wasn't really their concern. I think in those sort of circumstances, it's very hard, particularly for a band, to go on getting better at each album. I mean, sometimes they can take off or go and work with other people and come back together again and have new ideas. But there are very few bands which can do that. I think some individuals can. I mean, no one would have predicted Scott Walker's career, for example. So, yeah, I mean, David Bowie probably... I guess David Bowie, if you looked at his whole career, it would be difficult to say the first 3 albums were the best, or he always was capable of making a different sort of album with different sort of musicians. He was, in that sense, more of an artist than...
So my point in raising that is that there is something inherently valuable about newness in modern music. I
think there is. I mean, that's what we've all been. I mean, it's true in all. I mean, classical music world worries about, and orchestras worry about. The problem is if they put on anything new, audiences don't come, so they have to they always have to put on something that's popular and smuggle in something new. But then eventually, 50 years later, everybody likes Steve Reich or whoever it might be. So, tastes do change and people are there. And so you can see in jazz and folk, but in popular music it was odd because we had that sort of progressive rock moment, but it kind of stopped and became a nostalgic moment. I don't know what one would call progressive rock today.
Personally, I don't know why people are nostalgic for prog rock, because I can remember sitting through concerts thinking, when on earth is this going to end? It's just going on.
I think progressive prog rock was good in the sense it had that effect on audiences. No, there were good prog rock bands, obviously, and they were interesting. But that note, I mean, people don't go out. I mean, I think people's tastes are funny, and this is very difficult to know what you'd research, but people like us who sort of open ears will say to us, we don't always want to listen to the same thing.
No.
But at the same time, you're quite capable of going to a prog rock band and saying, this is terrible. This is not the sort of music I like. So your tastes, I think for everybody, tastes are changing, but they're not. But you tend to have things that you like and want to listen to.
Yeah.
And it's quite unusual for people to say, I only want to listen to things I haven't heard before.
Yes.
And I think there are people like that, and they become the sword of a certain sort of scenes.
Yeah. But it is difficult to do that, isn't it? If you're not one of those people, I mean, if you're an ordinary music lover, to say, I am going to deliberately seek out new music and try and listen to that exclusively. I try and do that by reading around and hearing what people on podcasts say and following up suggestions. And if somebody suggests a new band, I will do my best to listen to them. 9 times out of 10, I don't enjoy the experience of listening to them, even though I think it's an inherently worthwhile thing to do to seek out new music.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are. Yes, I mean, I think it is very. I mean, there's interesting things there. I remember thinking once, it's interesting. There are certain scenes that arise at a certain time, which value new music. So San Francisco in the '60s, where you had the funny mixture of Terry Riley and Grateful Dead, and all sorts of musicians who kind of gathered there and did, or New York at a certain time around the early days of the Ramones and those sort of people. There was simultaneously experimental jazz going on, and the worlds were overlapping. Yeah. Or I think in some ways the Fall were part, the Manchester Music Collective overlapping with the kind of club scene. So I think there are places when times where audiences are valuing going to something they know is new and unusual. Mm-hmm. But I think that depends on a certain sort of scene, which is not the norm.
Yeah. And what kind of scene do you think we're in at the moment?
Well, I think the scene at the moment is that on the whole, I mean, this is not based on any evidence because I don't go to as many gigs as I did. Mm-hmm. I think there's a big scene for people who want to celebrate something they've celebrated in the past, and which has been going on a long time. I remember meeting someone whose mother and her older sisters every time there was a Take That reunion tour, they would go to it because it was part of a celebration of something they'd celebrated before. So there's that sort of, and I guess like the Oasis thing, people are reliving the 1990s. But then a lot of people go to the pub and there's music playing and cover bands, so they recognise the music, but it might be played very well. And then there are people who are interested in going to jazz because they see themselves as jazz fans or folk clubs. But all those audiences are ageing. I think there was research at the Sage when I first came here which showed that the average age of the audience was oldest for jazz, then folk, and then classical. So what I don't know, and this if I was starting out again would be of interest, such is what do young people listen to? Mm-hmm. What live music do they go to?
Yeah.
And why?
I don't know that either. I mean, people as old as me are quite critical of the way that they see young people consuming music. But in fact, we don't actually know what young people choose to do with their music. We just look at it and we're quite judgmental about it.
Yeah, I mean, you see people, I like Sam Fender. I think he's a really skilled songwriter and stands for something important. And I guess he's picking up a youth audience. Mm-hmm. But I don't actually know that because I haven't been to a live concert.
Yeah.
And he's certainly appealing to people who like a certain sort of rock, which, Bruce Springsteenian, which means he might well have an older audience than he is. But I think the other thing to look at here is musicians and where musicians are coming from. And this is an interesting conversation going back to other things from a different perspective. These days, there's an awful lot more places than there were 30 years ago where you can do popular music at university or college, or jazz or folk. I mean, there are departments like at Newcastle of folk music. Most music conservatories now are not just classical, they've usually got good jazz departments and commercial music departments, they call them. So there are young people going into who are skilled musicians going into those sort of courses, and they're making music. I can't remember what it's called, but the music college in Leeds.
The conservatoire.
Yeah. They have a very good jazz programme, and as a result of that, they developed a very interesting local jazz scene in Leeds with interesting music crossing over genres, and Leeds also had a very strong very small indie scene, and they kind of overlapped. So you kind of get a sense of a musical culture developing, which has very little to do with Spotify and all those things.
Yeah, and that's true in Newcastle too, isn't it? Because they have the folk.
That's right. And there are a lot of very good folk and folk inflected things coming out of that.
It's true. Leeds does have a very good indie scene. They had some really good bands on there. Looking forward, given that we've been discussing the technology of AI and streaming platforms and the way that people use it, looking forward, you'd care to speculate about the next 10 years, what it means for, in particular, live music and grassroots music?
I wouldn't speculate, but I've raised some questions that I think, for example, that the basic definition for me of a musician is an opportunist. Mm-hmm. So people who want to make music and are committed to music are very good at finding opportunities to do it, which might be all sorts of. Yeah. And if you read any music biography, whatever sort of music, what becomes fascinating is how they determined quite early on to play and then find places to play. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways all this new technology has given them opportunities they didn't have before. You can certainly do a lot more home recording, you can use technology and sound in new sorts of ways. You can reach people through WhatsApp and all these things, or through Facebook. So there are many more ways of getting your music out there. I think it's much harder to develop a live music career. I think that's really interesting, but I think you can in some worlds. I think it's easier in jazz and folk where there are established venues and places which are open to having a young person come in and play. If you look at the indie scene and post-punk, what I find amazing is how many small towns there was some person who was determined to put this music on and would discover some really grotty, fallen-down pub in the back street and would put on gigs. I remember going in Birmingham to the most dreadful places, but seeing really quite good bands, both local and bringing in people like, American small punk bands. I don't know if that's still happening. I don't know if there is still a sort of young generation of people who are determined to have a place where they can put on live music, as I think there are in big cities, in somewhere like Glasgow or Leeds, as we were talking about.
Yeah, and Newcastle, in Brisbane Valley.
But I think in somewhere like Hexham, it's hard to see how that would happen. But then, of course, probably never did happen. No. People always had to go to Newcastle or London or go to college or to go to... I think colleges have always been very significant both art colleges and universities have been very significant for musicians because they provided an audience and spaces where people were away from home. They were trying to pretend that they were, their new life was a painting. Would be much more likely to go and see unexpected people. I think if you don't have that sort of thing, I think Hexham really lacks a college where you don't have anybody who's sort of, there's no art school, there's no sort of place where people might gather and make music. I think a lot of what's going to happen in the next 10 years will partly depend on what happens to universities, which are in a state of crisis, what happens to the whole notion of being a student and being a young person with opportunities. If those go, it's going to be much harder. And I think there are greater opportunities for recording and making music that you can put out over the web, but building an audience, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and of course, because the web is so accessible, more people are doing it, and the noise level is so much higher.
Yeah. But I remember going to see the special, because I was living in Coventry and the specials were from there, going to see the very early gigs in a pub. And they were astonishing. But they only really took off because somebody from London took them on, and therefore was able to find them gigs in London, which meant record companies were able to see what they were doing. So that sort of route is still, and the book I was reading about Newcastle bands and their problems, certainly the problem in the past was they had to get to London, really, to get seen by reviewers.
Is that too far north?
Yeah,
I've read that.
And so, you think that's still the case. And, if you don't have a local scene that can support music of various sorts, it's very problematic.
Which emphasises the importance of keeping our music in Northumberland going as we can.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not pessimistic because music is human necessity.
Yes.
Whether I like the music is a different matter altogether.
That's a whole other debate which I would like to have got into.
I mean, I've got, there's still a sort of a tape exchange around, but I remember reading somewhere that Radio 6 is for people who used to listen to John Peel and now are in their 70s and 80s. So they want to listen to music that sounds kind of cutting edge.
Yes, I know. I was a bit put out when I read that there's a name for people like me who go to small venues like the Cumberland Arms and the Cluny.
Oh yeah.
And watch bands, and they're called Six Music Dads.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. And the head of Radio 6, I think he still is also head of Radio 2, which I always thought. And he's now the chair of the Mercury Music Prize. Very nice guy, but I always thought that was interesting. His job at the BBC is to, what do you do with music as people get older? So on the one hand it's Radio 2, and on the other hand it's Radio 6.
Yeah. Well, Simon Frith, thank you very much for talking to me. It's been fascinating.
Good.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe and tell your friends about it.